It was a slow afternoon at Joe's Diner. The kind of day where time seemed to drag, and the usual customers came in like clockwork. Emily Dawson wiped down the counter, her brown hair tucked under a simple cap, unnoticed by the few who shuffled in for their coffee refills. She'd been here for a few months now, serving up plates of pancakes and bacon, just blending into the background. The diner was small, with red vinyl booths and a long counter lined with silver stools. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mixed with the sizzle of bacon on the griddle. It was the type of place where regulars knew each other by name, where the menu never changed, and the jukebox in the corner still played old songs for a quarter. Emily had gotten used to the routine. Every morning, she'd come in, tie on her apron, and start the day with the same tasks, wiping down the tables, refilling the sugar shakers, and making sure the coffee was hot and fresh. By now, she could do it all with her eyes closed. But Emily wasn't like the other waitresses who worked the shifts before her. No one knew much about her. She kept to herself, always polite but distant. People assumed she was just a quiet, young girl trying to make ends meet. They figured she was just another small-town girl working a job to pay her bills. They saw the shy smile, the quiet way she went about her business, and they never thought to look any deeper. Little did they know, she was the daughter of a man who could take down enemies with one hand tied behind his back, Commander Dawson, a decorated Navy veteran. Emily grew up in a household where discipline, strength, and resilience were part of everyday life. But here, at Joe's Diner, no one saw that side of her. At least, not yet. As the minutes passed, Emily glanced up at the clock hanging on the wall. It ticked slowly, each second dragging as the afternoon stretched on. The lunch rush had come and gone, and now the diner was quiet again. A few regulars sat in their usual spots. Mr. Johnson, an elderly man who ordered the same thing every day, black coffee, scrambled eggs, no toast, and the Stevens couple, who always shared a slice of pie after lunch. Emily brought Mr. Johnson his coffee, smiling softly as he thanked her. She didn't say much, just nodded politely and moved on to the next task. That was how she liked it: quiet, simple, easy. But there was more to Emily than met the eye. Beneath her calm exterior, there was a strength she rarely showed. She had learned that from her father. Growing up as the daughter of a Navy SEAL had shaped her in ways people couldn't imagine. Commander Dawson wasn't just any soldier. He was a man who had seen combat, who had led teams into dangerous situations and come out the other side. And he had taught Emily everything he knew. From a young age, Emily had trained with her father. While other kids were playing with dolls or watching cartoons, Emily was learning how to defend herself. She had spent hours in the backyard, practicing drills, running laps, and learning the techniques her father had perfected during his years of service. She wasn't just strong, she was skilled. And though she didn't show it often, that strength was always there, just beneath the surface. But here, at Joe's Diner, no one knew any of that. To them, she was just Emily, the quiet waitress who brought their coffee with a smile and never caused any trouble. And that was how she preferred it. She didn't need people to know about her past, about the training, or about her father's legacy. She was content to keep it all to herself. As the afternoon wore on, the diner remained quiet. Emily continued her work, moving from one task to the next with the same quiet efficiency. She wasn't one to complain or drag her feet. She did her job and did it well. That was another thing she had learned from her father: do everything to the best of your ability, no matter how small the task. The bell above the door jingled, and Emily glanced up to see a group of bikers walking in. She recognized them immediately. They had been in the diner once or twice before, always loud and rude, always causing a scene. They weren't regulars, but they weren't exactly strangers either. The leader of the group, a tall man with a skull tattoo covering his arm, strode up to the counter, his heavy boots clomping on the floor as he went. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice loud and full of sarcasm. "How about you bring us some burgers and make it snappy?" Emily didn't react. She was used to customers like this, people who thought they could push her around, who assumed she was just a weak, timid girl because she worked behind the counter. But she wasn't about to let them get under her skin. Without a word, she picked up her notepad and walked over to the table where the bikers had sat down. They were spread out across two booths, their leather jackets creaking as they leaned back, making themselves at home. The leader smirked up at her as she approached, clearly enjoying the power he thought he had over her. "5 burgers, he said, not bothering to look at the menu. "And make 'em fast. We don't have all day." Emily wrote down the order, her face calm and expressionless. She had dealt with people like this before, loud, arrogant, and full of themselves. But she wasn't intimidated. She had learned a long time ago not to let people like this get to her. Instead, she kept her cool, knowing that she could handle herself if things ever got out of hand. The other bikers laughed and joked loudly, making crude comments about the diner, the food, and even Emily herself. But she didn't flinch. She simply nodded, took the order, and turned to head back to the kitchen. As she walked away, she could hear the leader mutter something under his breath, followed by more laughter from the group. But Emily didn't let it bother her. She had been through worse. Much worse. Back in the kitchen, Joe, the diner's owner, was flipping burgers on the grill. He was a big man, with a gruff voice and a kind heart. He'd owned the diner for over 20 years, and he treated his employees like family. When Emily had first started working there, Joe had taken her under his wing, showing her the ropes and making sure she felt at home. "Those guys giving you trouble?" Joe asked, glancing up as Emily handed him the order slip. "Nothing I can't handle," Emily replied, her voice steady. Joe grunted in response, flipping a burger with a practiced flick of his wrist. "If they get out of line, you let me know," he said. "I don't want any trouble in my diner." Emily smiled faintly. Joe was protective of his staff, and she appreciated that. But she knew she could handle herself. She had been dealing with people like this for most of her life. As Joe worked on the burgers, Emily leaned against the counter, her mind drifting back to her father. Commander Dawson had always been there for her, teaching her how to stand up for herself, how to be strong in the face of adversity. He had raised her to be tough, to never back down from a challenge. And though he wasn't here now, his lessons had stayed with her. Outside in the diner, the bikers were getting louder, their laughter filling the small space. They didn't seem to care about the other customers, who were now glancing over nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The leader of the group was the worst, his voice carrying over the others as he made crude jokes and tossed insults around like they were nothing. Emily could hear them from the kitchen, but she didn't let it get to her. She had learned to block out the noise, to focus on the task at hand and not let distractions pull her away from what needed to be done. That was something her father had drilled into her: focus. Stay calm, stay sharp, and always be ready. When the burgers were ready, Emily loaded them onto a tray and carried them out to the biker's table. As she approached, the leader looked up at her with a smirk, clearly enjoying the idea of making her uncomfortable. "About time," he said, leaning back in his seat. "Thought you forgot about us." Emily didn't respond. She simply placed the plates in front of them, her face calm and neutral. But as she turned to walk away, the leader reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her back toward him. "Hey," he said, his grip tight. "I asked you a question. You deaf or something?" The diner fell silent. Emily looked down at his hand, then up at him, her eyes cold and steady. "Let go," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the peaceful afternoon at Joe's diner, like a storm rolling in out of nowhere. Emily didn't need to look up. She knew exactly who it was. The sound of those engines, roaring like wild animals, was unmistakable. The door swung open with a loud creak, letting in a gust of cold air, and with it, trouble. A group of bikers strutted in, dressed in black leather jackets, their faces hard, their eyes scanning the room like they owned the place. They weren't regulars, but they'd been here before. Loud. Rude. Always acting like they were better than everyone else. They took up space wherever they went, their presence heavy and intimidating. The leader of the group stood out the most. He was tall, with greasy black hair that hung down to his shoulders. A large skull tattoo covered his arm, wrapping around his bicep like a badge of intimidation. He made his way straight to the counter, his boots thudding heavily against the diner's old wooden floor. His posture screamed arrogance. Like he was used to getting his way. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice thick with sarcasm. His lips curled into a smug smile as he looked at Emily behind the counter. "How about you bring us some burgers and make it snappy?" His words hung in the air, dripping with disrespect. Emily could feel the weight of his stare, but she didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like him before. The kind who thought they could talk down to her just because she was a waitress, just because she wore an apron and served food for a living. But Emily wasn't the type to get rattled easily. She knew how to keep her cool, even when things got tough. She looked up from the coffee pot she was holding, her expression calm, her face unreadable. She didn't let them see the irritation that was slowly building inside her. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. "Sure thing," she said simply, her voice steady, without a hint of emotion. She reached for her notepad and pen, ready to take their order, her movements smooth and practiced. The bikers laughed, their voices echoing through the small diner as they slouched into the booths, spreading out like they owned the place. One of them knocked over a salt shaker with his elbow, sending it crashing to the floor. Another threw his dirty boots up on the table, not caring about the mess he was making. The whole scene was a disruption to the usual quiet, easygoing rhythm of the diner. Emily could feel the tension rising in the room. The other customers were starting to get uncomfortable. She noticed Mr. Johnson, an elderly man who always sat at the counter, shift nervously in his seat. The Stevens couple, sitting near the window, exchanged worried glances. But no one said a word. They were all too afraid to speak up. The bikers had that effect on people. Their mere presence demanded silence. Emily walked over to the booth where the bikers had settled, her face calm, her hands steady. She wasn't afraid of them. She had learned long ago how to deal with people like this. You had to stay cool, keep your head down, and not show any weakness. That was the key. It was something her father had drilled into her during all those years of training in their backyard. Stay calm. Stay focused. Don't let them get to you. "You deaf, girl," the leader shouted again, his voice louder this time. He slammed his fist down on the counter, rattling the plates and cups nearby. "I said, make it quick." Emily paused for a second, taking a deep breath. She felt a flicker of anger deep inside, but she pushed it down. If only they knew who they were dealing with. If only they knew what she was capable of. But she wasn't going to let them push her buttons. Not yet. The bikers continued to make a scene, laughing loudly, throwing insults around like they were playing some kind of game. They didn't care about the other people in the diner. To them, everyone else was just background noise. They were the stars of their own show, and they loved the attention, even if it was negative. The leader, still smirking, leaned back in his seat, watching Emily with a look of amusement in his eyes. He thought he had her figured out. He thought she was just another scared little waitress who would jump at his command, who would rush to serve him just to avoid trouble. But Emily wasn't scared. She had been through too much in her life to be frightened by a group of loudmouthed bikers. She had grown up with a father who had faced real danger, real threats. Commander Dawson didn't raise a daughter who would be easily intimidated. He raised a fighter, someone who could stand her ground when things got tough. Emily kept her expression neutral as she approached the leader's table. She took out her notepad, ready to write down their order. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice calm, professional. The leader leaned forward, his smirk widening. 5 burgers. "And make 'em fast," he said, his tone mocking. He looked around at his friends, who all snickered in response. "We don't have all day." Emily nodded, jotting down the order quickly. "Anything else?" she asked, not looking up from her notepad. "Yeah," the leader said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "How about a smile? Or is that too much to ask?" The bikers erupted in laughter, their voices filling the diner once again. Emily didn't react. She had heard worse. Much worse. She had dealt with far tougher situations than this, and she wasn't about to let a group of bikers get under her skin. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the counter, where she handed the order to Joe in the kitchen. Joe was the owner of the diner, a big man with a kind heart and a no-nonsense attitude. He glanced at the order, then looked up at Emily, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay out there?" Joe asked, his voice low. He had seen the bikers come in, and he knew what kind of trouble they could cause. Emily nodded. "I'm fine," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Just another group of rowdy customers." Joe grunted in response, flipping the burgers on the grill with practiced ease. "Well, if they give you any trouble, you let me know," he said, his tone firm. "I don't want them causing any problems." Emily appreciated Joe's concern, but she knew she could handle herself. She had been trained for situations far worse than this. Still, it was nice to know that Joe had her back. He was like a protective older brother, always looking out for her and the other waitresses who worked at the diner. As Emily waited for the food to cook, she glanced back at the bikers. They were still laughing, still making a mess of the place. One of them had spilled ketchup all over the table, and another was flicking peanuts at the jukebox in the corner, trying to hit the buttons. It was clear that they didn't care about anyone but themselves. The other customers were starting to get more uncomfortable. Mr. Johnson had pulled his hat down low, trying to avoid eye contact with the bikers. The Stevens couple was whispering to each other, their faces tied with worry. Emily could feel the tension in the air. It was thick, heavy, like a storm cloud waiting to break. But Emily wasn't going to let the bikers ruin her day. She had dealt with worse. Much worse. She had seen what real fear looked like, what real danger felt like. And this? This was nothing compared to that. The food was ready, and Emily carefully loaded the plates onto a tray. She carried it over to the bikers' table, setting the plates down in front of them with the same calm expression she always wore. She wasn't about to let them see any hint of fear or frustration. "Here you go," she said simply, placing the last plate down in front of the leader. The leader looked up at her, his smirk still in place. "Took you long enough," he said, his tone full of mockery. He picked up a fry and popped it into his mouth, chewing slowly as he watched her. Emily didn't respond. She had learned a long time ago that people like him weren't worth her energy. She wasn't going to give him the reaction he wanted. As she turned to walk away, she felt a hand grab her wrist. It was the leader, his grip tight, pulling her back toward him. "Hey," he said, his voice low, his eyes locking onto hers. "I asked you a question. You deaf or something?" The diner went silent. All eyes were on them now. The other bikers stopped laughing, their attention suddenly focused on the scene unfolding at their table. Emily looked down at his hand, then back up at him. Her face remained calm, her eyes steady. She could feel the tension rising, but she didn't let it show. "Let go," she said quietly, her voice firm but controlled. The leader's smirk widened. He tightened his grip on her wrist, leaning in closer. "Or what?" he asked, his tone challenging. That was his mistake. Emily had been trained for moments like this. She knew how to handle herself in a confrontation. Her father had made sure of that. Commander Dawson didn't just teach her how to fight, he taught her how to stay calm under pressure, how to assess a situation, and how to react quickly and efficiently. She didn't need to think. Her body moved on instinct. In one swift motion, she twisted her wrist free from his grip, using his own momentum against him. Before he could react, she stepped back, putting space between them. The leader blinked, clearly surprised by how quickly she had slipped out of his grasp. The smirk faded from his face, replaced by a look of confusion. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said, his voice rising with anger now. "You're just a waitress. You don't know who you're messing with." Emily stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to prove herself to him. She knew what she was capable of. The other bikers were watching closely now, their expressions shifting from amusement to something more serious. The tension in the diner had reached its peak. Emily stood still, her wrist locked in the grip of the biker's hand. The diner felt frozen, as if time itself had paused. All eyes were on them now, the usual clinking of plates and low murmur of conversation replaced by an eerie silence. The other customers watched with nervous anticipation, unsure of what was going to happen next. The other bikers leaned forward, some of them grinning, expecting some sort of confrontation. The leader, still holding onto her wrist, smirked. His friends chuckled behind him, enjoying the show. They had no idea what they were dealing with. To them, Emily was just another waitress, an easy target, someone they could push around for their own amusement. They didn't know her past, didn't know who she really was. But Emily knew exactly who they were. She could read them like a book. Her father had taught her well, people like this only acted tough when they thought they had the upper hand. They thrived on making others feel small. But when confronted with real strength, they folded. They weren't as brave as they pretended to be. "Let go," Emily repeated, her voice steady and firm, though not loud. There was no panic, no fear in her tone, just quiet authority. The biker's smirk widened as he tightened his grip, clearly not taking her seriously. "Or what?" he taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. Emily's calm demeanor didn't change, but internally, she made a decision. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but it seemed this man needed a lesson. A small, controlled surge of adrenaline coursed through her as her father's voice echoed in her mind from years of training: "Stay calm. Focus. Always control the situation, never let the situation control you." In one fluid motion, Emily shifted her body slightly, using the leverage she had learned from years of self-defense training. She twisted her wrist just enough to break free from his grip, stepping back with precision. The movement was so quick, so efficient, that the biker barely had time to react. His hand closed on nothing but air. The diner gasped, surprised by how effortlessly she had freed herself. The biker looked down at his now empty hand, blinking in confusion. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Emily. "That's it," he sneered, trying to cover up his embarrassment. "You think that's gonna scare me?" Emily didn't respond. She had no need to. Instead, she simply stood there, her eyes locked on his, her posture calm but poised like a coiled spring, ready to act if necessary. The other bikers, sensing a shift in the dynamic, exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader wasn't used to being defied, especially not by someone they saw as weak. But there was something about the way Emily carried herself that made them pause. They had expected her to back down, to cower under their leader's intimidation. But she hadn't. In fact, she seemed completely unfazed by him. The leader, trying to regain control of the situation, took a step forward, his expression hardening. "You're making a big mistake, girl," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know who you're messing with." But that was where he was wrong. Emily knew exactly who she was dealing with. She had seen men like him before, men who relied on fear and intimidation to get their way. Men who thought strength was about muscle and volume. But real strength, as her father had always taught her, was about control. And right now, she had all the control. As the tension in the diner thickened, Emily's mind briefly drifted back to those early mornings in her father's backyard. Commander Dawson, her father, had been a hard man, but fair. He had always believed that Emily needed to be prepared for anything, not just physically but mentally as well. Growing up as the daughter of a Navy veteran, she had learned discipline and resilience from a young age. "I'm not raising you to be afraid of the world," her father would often say as they sparred in the backyard. "I'm raising you to face it head on." And that's exactly what she had done her entire life. When things got tough, Emily didn't back down. She stayed calm, focused, and controlled. Today was no different. The biker's friends, who had been laughing and egging him on just moments ago, now sat in silence. They were watching closely, no longer as confident as they had been when they walked in. Something had shifted, and they could feel it. The leader, still trying to maintain his tough guy act, glared at Emily. "You think you're better than me, huh?" he spat. "Just 'cause you broke free from my grip? That don't mean nothing." Emily remained silent. She didn't need to respond to his words. She had already shown him that she wasn't afraid. The truth was, she didn't care what he thought of her. His opinion meant nothing. All she cared about was keeping the peace in the diner and making sure that the other customers weren't put in harm's way. She could see the other patrons out of the corner of her eye. Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who came in every day for coffee and toast, was watching nervously. The Stevens couple, who always sat by the window, had their eyes wide with worry. Emily knew that these people looked to her for safety now. She wasn't just a waitress to them. In this moment, she was their protector. The leader, frustrated by Emily's silence and the fact that she wasn't reacting the way he had expected, took another step toward her, his fists clenching at his sides. "You better watch yourself, girl," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Things could get real ugly real fast." But Emily didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her heart steady, her breathing calm. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She wasn't going to let him win. And that's when it happened. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the diner swung open with a loud creak, and in walked a man Emily recognized immediately: Deputy Tom Harris, the local lawman. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a steady gaze and a no-nonsense attitude. He had been with the sheriff's department for years, and everyone in town knew him as a man who didn't tolerate trouble. The moment the bikers saw him, their attitudes changed. The leader's bravado faltered slightly, and his friends shifted uneasily in their seats. They knew that causing trouble with the law around was a bad idea. Deputy Harris walked into the diner, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the situation quickly. He noticed the tension, the way the bikers were seated, the way Emily stood tall in front of their leader. Without a word, he walked over to the counter, tipping his hat to Emily. "Afternoon, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Everything all right here?" Emily nodded, her expression still neutral. "Everything's fine, Deputy," she replied, her voice steady. "Just a little misunderstanding." Deputy Harris looked over at the biker leader, his gaze hardening slightly. "A misunderstanding, huh?" The leader, sensing that the situation had changed, quickly dropped the tough guy act. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a smile. "We were just ordering some food." The deputy didn't look convinced, but he wasn't about to escalate things if they didn't need to be escalated. "Well," he said, his voice firm, "I suggest you keep it that way. We don't want any trouble here, do we?" The leader shook his head quickly. "No trouble, officer. We're just here for lunch." Deputy Harris nodded, satisfied for the moment. "Good. Then you boys enjoy your meal, and let's keep things peaceful." With that, the tension in the room began to ease. The bikers, clearly not wanting to push their luck with the law, settled back into their seats, their earlier cockiness replaced by a more subdued demeanor. Emily, still standing by the counter, finally allowed herself to relax a little. The situation had defused for now, but she knew that it wasn't over. People like that didn't forget when they felt humiliated, and she had a feeling that the leader wasn't going to let this go so easily. As she continued with her shift, serving food and refilling coffee cups, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The bikers ate their meal quietly, their earlier bravado gone, but every now and then, Emily could feel their eyes on her, especially the leader's. He was watching her closely, as if trying to figure out how he had misjudged her, how he had lost control of the situation. But Emily didn't let it bother her. She had done what she needed to do, kept the peace without letting things get out of hand. That was all that mattered. She wasn't looking for trouble, but if it came her way, she was ready. As the bikers finished their meal and began to leave, the leader lingered behind for a moment. He stood by the door, his eyes locking onto Emily's one last time. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Emily met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm and steady. "It is if you want it to be," she replied quietly. The leader sneered but didn't say anything more. He pushed the door open and walked out, his friends following close behind. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air as they sped away down the road, leaving the diner in an uneasy silence. Emily stood by the counter, watching them go. She didn't know when or where, but she had a feeling they would be back. And when they did return, she would be ready. The other customers, who had been holding their breath throughout the entire ordeal, finally began to relax. Mr. Johnson sighed in relief, and the Stevens couple exchanged nervous glances. One by one, they all began to return to their meals, the tension slowly fading from the room. Deputy Harris, still standing by the counter, gave Emily a reassuring nod. "You handled that well," he said. "Not many people would have stayed that calm." Emily smiled faintly. "Thanks, Deputy. I've had a lot of practice." Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about her comment, but he didn't press for details. Instead, he gave her a polite nod and made his way to the door. "If they come back," he said, pausing briefly, "you know where to find me." "I appreciate that," Emily replied. And with that, the deputy left, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. As the sun began to set and the last of the customers trickled out, Emily finally allowed herself to relax. The day had been long, and the confrontation with the bikers had taken more out of her than she cared to admit. But she was proud of herself for staying calm, for not letting them get the better of her. As she wiped down the tables and prepared to close up for the night, she couldn't help but think of her father. He had always taught her to be strong, to stand up for herself no matter what. And today, she had done exactly that. But something told her that this wasn't the end of it. The bikers might be gone for now, but they weren't the type to let things go. They would be back. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, as if time had slowed. Emily's grip on the biker's wrist was firm, unyielding. The shock on his face was evident as pain registered where he had previously felt nothing but control. His arrogance, so thick moments earlier, dissolved into confusion and fear. The yelp that escaped his lips was not the sound of a man in command, but one taken entirely by surprise. He had expected a meek girl, someone who would cower under his intimidation, not the person standing before him, now a woman who was clearly much more than she appeared. The customers in the diner, who had been holding their breath during the tension, let out collective gasps of disbelief. This wasn't what they had expected either. They had watched Emily for months, quietly going about her job, serving meals, refilling coffee, always with a soft smile but never drawing attention to herself. And now, with just one swift movement, she had completely changed the dynamics in the room. She was no longer just the quiet waitress everyone thought they knew. In that moment, she was something much more powerful, something formidable. The other bikers, who had been lounging at their table and laughing at their leader's antics, stood up abruptly, their chairs scraping harshly against the floor. They looked uncertain, caught between the instinct to rush to their friend's defense and the realization that they might not be facing the same woman they had underestimated a minute ago. Their expressions, once filled with cocky grins, were now hesitant. They didn't move, though they clearly wanted to. Emily released the biker's wrist and took a calm step back, giving him space. She didn't need to hold onto him anymore, she had already made her point. He stumbled back, clutching his wrist as if still trying to understand what had just happened. His confidence had crumbled, leaving behind only fear and confusion. His eyes, wide and disbelieving, searched Emily's face for some kind of explanation, something to make sense of how this quiet waitress had just so easily bested him. For a moment, no one in the diner spoke. The tension was thick, the silence heavy. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to disappear as every person in the room waited to see what would happen next. Emily's voice, when she spoke, was calm but filled with authority. It cut through the silence like a knife. "You think you can just walk in here and treat people like dirt?" she asked, her gaze moving slowly from the leader to each of the other bikers. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that made everyone stop and listen. "You think you can act tough, push people around, and there won't be consequences?" Her eyes landed back on the leader, who was still cradling his wrist. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The leader swallowed hard, his earlier bravado completely gone. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if he didn't know how to respond to this new version of Emily, the woman who had just turned his world upside down with a single move. I don't," he stammered, but Emily cut him off. "Who am I?" she asked, her tone sharp, commanding. "I'll tell you who I am." She took a step closer to him, and though she was smaller in stature, in that moment, she seemed to tower over him. Her presence was undeniable, and every person in the diner could feel it. "I'm the daughter of Commander Dawson," she said, her voice steady and clear, "a Navy SEAL who spent his life protecting this country, and who taught me everything I know about handling men like you." The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. The customers exchanged stunned glances, murmuring softly among themselves. Commander Dawson's name carried weight, especially in a town like theirs. He was a local hero, a man respected by everyone who knew him. But no one had known that Emily, the quiet waitress who blended into the background, was his daughter. The leader of the bikers blinked, his bravado fading even further. His face paled as he processed what she had just said. "Navy SEAL," he muttered, as if trying to comprehend how someone so small, so unassuming, could be connected to a man like Commander Dawson. Emily didn't give him time to recover. "And if you want to walk out of here without a limp," she continued, her tone growing even firmer, "I suggest you sit down and behave." Her words were simple, but the threat behind them was crystal clear. She wasn't just talking, she meant every word. The tension in the diner shifted once again, this time in Emily's favor. The bikers, who had swaggered in like they owned the place, were now the ones uncertain, unsure of their next move. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. The leader looked at Emily, his eyes wide with fear, before glancing back at his friends. They had been watching in stunned silence, clearly unsure of what to do. None of them seemed eager to step forward now. Whatever fight they had thought they had in them was quickly fading. "I said, sit down," Emily repeated, her voice still calm but unyielding. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority came from within, and it was undeniable. The leader, still holding his wrist, hesitated for a moment longer. Then, slowly, he nodded and backed away, moving to sit down at the booth he had come from. His friends followed suit, their expressions sullen and defeated. They no longer looked like the cocky troublemakers who had swaggered in minutes earlier. The diner, which had been filled with tension and fear, now seemed to exhale all at once. The customers, who had been frozen in shock, began to relax. Some of them exchanged relieved smiles, while others just stared at Emily in awe. No one had expected this outcome, least of all the bikers. Emily, for her part, remained calm. She didn't gloat, didn't show any sign of satisfaction. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough for her. She had no interest in humiliating them further. Her goal had always been to keep the peace, and now that peace had been restored, she was content. But the bikers weren't quite done. Though they had been humbled, their leader still couldn't fully accept what had happened. He glared at Emily from his seat, his pride wounded, and muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." Emily's gaze flicked to him, but she didn't bother to respond. There was nothing more to say. She had already made her point. The only thing left for him to do was accept it or leave. And leave they did. The bikers, now thoroughly deflated, finished their meals in silence. They paid their bill without causing any more trouble and walked out of the diner without a word. The roar of their motorcycles as they sped off down the road was the only sign that they had ever been there at all. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the diner finally broke completely. The customers let out a collective sigh of relief, and a few even began to clap softly, their admiration for Emily clear. Mr. Johnson, who had been sitting at the counter the whole time, smiled up at her. "I knew there was something different about you," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen." Emily smiled back at him, though her expression remained humble. "Just doing what I had to," she said simply. The Stevens couple, still seated by the window, nodded in agreement. "You're one tough lady," Mrs. Stevens said with a chuckle. "Those bikers didn't know what hit 'em." Emily chuckled softly, but inside, she felt a sense of calm satisfaction. She had done what her father had always taught her. She had remained calm, controlled the situation, and protected the people around her. That was what mattered most. As the evening wore on and the last few customers trickled out of the diner, Emily finally had a moment to herself. She stood behind the counter, wiping it down as she reflected on what had happened. It wasn't often that she had to tap into the skills her father had taught her, but when the moment called for it, she was glad that she had them. Her thoughts drifted back to her father, Commander Dawson. He had always been a larger-than-life figure in her eyes, a man of unwavering strength and discipline. Growing up with him had been both challenging and rewarding. He had never treated her like she was fragile, never sheltered her from the realities of the world. Instead, he had prepared her for them, teaching her how to be strong, how to stand up for herself, and how to protect others. "Never let anyone tell you what you can or can't do," he had always said. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. And when the time comes, you'll know what to do." He had been right. Emily smiled softly to herself, thinking about how proud he would have been of her today. She hadn't wanted to use force, but when the situation had called for it, she had acted with precision and control, just as he had taught her. As the clock ticked closer to closing time, Emily finished cleaning up the diner. The events of the day had been intense, but she felt a sense of peace now. The bikers might come back someday, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced worse before, and she was ready for whatever came next. When she finally locked the door and turned off the lights, the diner was quiet once again. The peaceful hum of the evening settled in, and Emily walked out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. As she made her way home, the stars twinkling above her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had stood her ground, protected the people in the diner, and reminded herself of the strength she carried within her. And that, above all else, was what mattered most. The tension in Joe's diner didn't last much longer after the bikers left. Their leader, still nursing his bruised wrist, had clearly lost his appetite for confrontation. As he stood there, glancing at Emily, there was a mixture of respect and fear in his eyes. He had thought he could push her around, but in the end, it was he who had been forced to retreat. His followers, once loud and boisterous, quickly seemed to shrink back into themselves. They mumbled among themselves as they slinked out of the diner, their heads low and their pride shattered. The roar of their motorcycles, which had once been a sign of their dominance, now sounded like the retreating noise of defeated men. When the door swung shut behind them, the entire atmosphere in the diner shifted. It felt like the room took a collective breath. For the first time that day, the air seemed clear and fresh, no longer thick with fear or anxiety. The customers, who had been holding their breath, exhaled at the same time. Then, without warning, a slow, hesitant applause began. It was Mrs. Stevens, the older woman sitting by the window, who started it. She clapped softly, her hands trembling slightly, but she was smiling. And soon, Mr. Johnson, the regular who had always sat at the counter, joined in, his hearty clapping reverberating through the room. Before long, the entire diner was clapping, some with wide smiles, others with looks of disbelief, but all of them grateful for the turn of events. Emily stood there, quietly wiping down the counter as the applause swelled around her. It was almost as if she hadn't noticed it at first. She kept her eyes on the counter, her movements steady and practiced. But she could hear the cheers, the soft laughter, the admiration in the room. It was hard to ignore. When the applause finally died down, Emily simply nodded in acknowledgement, but there was no smile on her face. She wasn't one for drama or attention. She was used to working in the background, blending into the routine of the diner. She had done what was necessary to protect the people in the room, and that was enough for her. She didn't need praise. She wasn't doing this for applause. "Thank you, everyone," she said softly, her voice just above a whisper. Her words didn't need to be loud. They were sincere and calm, the way she always spoke. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some work to do." With that, she returned to her duties. She didn't linger in the moment, didn't bask in the glory. That wasn't who she was. She was simply a waitress, doing her job, keeping the peace. But even as she moved about, cleaning the counter and filling coffee cups, she could feel the change in the air. There was a new level of respect from the customers, a recognition of who she was and what she had done. It was subtle but undeniable. Some of them exchanged looks, while others whispered amongst themselves. Emily could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the task at hand. It wasn't long before the last of the customers paid their bills and began to leave. The diner, once filled with tension, was now calm and peaceful. The doors jingled as people stepped out into the cool evening, and the sounds of the outside world, cars, footsteps, distant chatter filtered in through the open door. Mr. Johnson, who had been sitting at the counter through it all, turned to her as he finished his coffee. "You really showed them, didn't you, Emily?" he said with a grin. "You were something else today. You're tougher than most people give you credit for." Emily gave him a small, humble smile. "I just did what needed to be done," she replied. "Nothing special about that." But Mr. Johnson shook his head. "You know, sometimes people are more than they seem. And today, you proved that." She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she took a moment to glance at the clock on the wall. It was almost closing time. The diner was nearly empty now, and she could finally relax. The excitement of the afternoon had faded, leaving her feeling strangely calm. She finished cleaning the counter and turned off the coffee machine. The hum of the fridge was the only sound left in the diner now. She took a deep breath, feeling the quiet settle over her. It had been a long day, but she had handled it. She always did. But this time, something was different. The events of the day had made her realize that maybe she wasn't just the quiet waitress at Joe's diner anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she had earned a bit of respect from the people around her. The bikers had learned that lesson the hard way. And while Emily wasn't the type to boast about it, she knew that she had proved something today, something more important than just physical strength. She had shown them that sometimes, strength comes from within. As she locked the door and turned off the lights, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. She had faced down trouble, kept the peace, and protected the people in the diner. That was what mattered. And it wasn't just the bikers who had learned a lesson. She had, too. When she walked outside into the cool evening air, she felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. The stars above twinkled brightly, and the air was fresh, filled with the promise of a quiet night. Emily took a deep breath, letting the peacefulness of the evening settle into her bones. It had been a hard day, but in the end, justice had been served. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength and resilience to handle it. Whether it was another confrontation like today's or something entirely different, Emily was prepared. Because, just like her father had taught her, she knew how to stand up for what was right and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. With that, she turned and made her way home. The diner behind her was quiet now, the lights off, the windows dark. But in her heart, Emily knew that the diner had become something more than just a place where she worked. It was where she had found her own strength, where she had stood up for herself and the people around her, and where she had earned the respect she deserved. And as the night grew darker, Emily walked on, ready for whatever the future held. The night grew colder as Emily worked, the routine of wiping down tables and tidying up the diner giving her time to reflect on the events of the day. The laughter and cheers had long since faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the diner as it prepared to close for the night. As the last of the customers left, Emily found herself standing in the middle of the diner, surrounded by empty chairs and untouched coffee cups. The day had been anything but ordinary, but now, in the silence, it felt like just another chapter in her life. A life full of quiet strength and unspoken resilience. The regulars had started to notice. They had seen it before in her, the way she held herself, the calmness in her eyes, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate even when she wasn't trying. She wasn't just the girl who served their food. She wasn't just the waitress who kept the coffee flowing and the pancakes hot. She was someone who had seen more, lived more, and carried the strength of someone far beyond her years. The old man who sat by the window, Mr. Johnson, had been watching her carefully all afternoon. He had seen the bikers come in, seen them threaten her, heard their taunts and their insults. But when he had watched Emily stand her ground, when he had seen her take control of the situation with a calmness that defied everything they had expected, he couldn't help but respect her. And it wasn't just him. Mrs. Stevens, who always came in for the early morning coffee, had been watching too. She had seen Emily grow from a quiet, shy girl into someone who carried herself with quiet dignity. Emily wasn't loud, she didn't seek attention, and she didn't try to be anything she wasn't. But in that one moment, when she faced down the bikers and sent them packing, everyone in that diner knew who she really was. And it wasn't just about the fight, not really. It was about something much deeper. It was about the way she handled herself in a world that often seemed chaotic and loud. It was about the strength she had inside her, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout or make a scene. The kind of strength that showed up in how she stood her ground, how she protected those around her, and how she never backed down when it mattered most. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones you least expect. Emily wasn't the type to boast about what she had done. She didn't seek praise, and she didn't care for recognition. But that didn't mean she didn't deserve it. The people in the diner had seen it. They had witnessed the quiet courage it took to face down those bikers, to protect the others, and to stay calm when everything around her was chaos. And in a world full of people who judged by appearances, Emily showed them all that sometimes, the quiet strength leaves the greatest impact. There was no loud announcement, no grand gesture. Just the simple act of standing her ground, of refusing to let fear control her. And that was all it took. That one moment spoke louder than any words could. As Emily finished cleaning the last of the tables and began to lock up for the night, she couldn't help but think about the lessons she had learned over the years. She had been raised by a father who had shown her the value of hard work, discipline, and integrity. A father who had taught her that strength wasn't always about physical power, it was about mental resilience, the ability to keep going when things got tough, and the ability to stand up for what was right, no matter the odds. And now, as she looked around the empty diner, she realized that those lessons had stayed with her. They had shaped who she was, even when she didn't fully understand it at the time. It was why she hadn't flinched when the bikers had taunted her. It was why she had stayed calm and composed, even when it seemed like everything was going wrong. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the daughter of Commander Dawson, a man who had faced danger and hardship with courage and strength. And Emily carried that same fire inside her, whether anyone knew it or not. She stepped outside into the cool night air, locking the door behind her. The stars above twinkled brightly, casting a soft glow over the quiet street. Emily stood for a moment, just breathing in the night. There was something peaceful about it, something calming that made all the chaos of the day feel distant, like it had happened to someone else. But in that moment, she realized something else too. She had earned something today, not just the respect of the people in the diner, but her own respect. She had reminded herself of her own strength, of the lessons her father had taught her all those years ago. She had faced down danger, stood her ground, and protected those who couldn't protect themselves. She had done what needed to be done, without hesitation or fear. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt proud of who she was. There were no grand accolades waiting for her. No big speeches, no awards, no attention from the outside world. But that was okay. Because she didn't need any of that. What mattered was that, in the quiet of the diner and the peace of the night, Emily knew that she was stronger than she had ever realized. And sometimes, that quiet strength was the most powerful thing of all. As she walked home, the cool breeze cooling her hair, she couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a smile of arrogance or boastfulness. It was the kind of smile that came from deep within, one that came from knowing she had done what was right, and that she had the power to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because she knew, more than anything, that true strength was never about how loud you could shout or how big you could act. It was about how quietly, how firmly, you could stand in the face of adversity. And in that moment, Emily Dawson felt like she was ready for whatever the world had to offer. Because she had the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. It simply was. And that was enough.